I welcome everybody back this afternoon. Glad that we can be together again on this Lord's Day to worship God together and to encourage one another. We tend to be, anyway, a society that is obsessed with numbers. We like to have our data sheets and we like to extrapolate, take the data from the previous decade and extrapolate data for the next decade and all kinds of metrics in terms of population, in terms of expected the life expectancy and so forth. In budgetary terms, numbers are a constant. I looked up the life expectancy in the United States for 2019. I was actually kind of surprised. The United States is ranked 53rd in the world in life expectancy at 79 years. I didn't realize we were that low. But the highest is actually Hong Kong at 86. I thought that was kind of interesting. We're also obsessed with numbers when it comes to delineating time. And I've talked about this in the past in terms of how we observe time and how we think about our place in the vastness of the universe. But rather than going macro and looking at bigger and bigger scales, why don't we go micro for a moment and kind of put in perspective our life from beginning to end, from birth to death. If we truly have 80 years, okay, let's just assume that metric is generally or thereabout correct. That on average, 80 years might be something that we can attain. You realize how many months 80 years of life is. It's 960 months. 960 months equates to 29,200 days. That's a very important number. Try to keep that in your mind, 29,000 number of days, because that's going to be important going forward. 700,800 hours. This is your life in numbers if you get to live to 80. For a moment, humor me for a minute. And I want you to imagine that all of life, from birth to death, instead of taking place, let's say in our projected 80 years, instead it took place in 100 days. Just try to imagine that for a moment. You're born, there's day one, and then you die at day 100. I want you to imagine for a moment, if you break that down and contrast it to what, at least in 2019, the average American expectancy of life is. 100 days equates to actually 3.33333 months. That's the 3.5-ish. 2,400 hours. That doesn't seem like a lot, does it? 144,000 minutes. Your average movie is about 200 minutes long. And then you age 10 months for each day of that 100 days. The day after you're born, you're 10 months old. Day after that, you're 20 months old. Day after that, you're well into your first year. And so on, and so on, and so on. You might be asking yourself, why in the world are we doing this exercise? There's a reason. But just try to imagine what that type of life would be like. Just 100 days, that's all. Not even as if we're only given 100 days to live, like we have some kind of disease or something. No, your entire lifespan is in 100 days. And I want you to imagine that as we go through and consider some of the scriptures that God gives us, that reminds us of having the proper perspective on our lives. If you only had 100 days in your entire lifespan, looking at it from where you are now would that change anything for you? If all of a sudden, if you could carry over the knowledge, okay, I once was living 80 years, now I only have 100 days, would it change your priorities? Would it change how you choose to use your time? Would it change what you value? In the 89th Psalm and in verse 47, the psalmist says, "Remember how short my time is, for what futility have you created all the children of men." The psalmist is speaking to God. And he's asking God, he's making requests of God about his anger and so forth. He says, "Remember how short my time is. That I'm only here for a little while." This is your average individual of the Old Testament. Their average lifespan, I mean, you talk about 80 years, average lifespan of people in the Old Testament is in around 50, maybe. "For what futility have you created all of the children of men?" The futility of which the psalmist speaks isn't the idea that God has made man just to kind of be there. It's the idea of the fact that our lives are limited, very much connected to what Solomon is talking about in Ecclesiastes on our Wednesday night Bible class. Verse 48, our psalmist goes on to say, "What man can live and not see death? Can he deliver his life from the power of the grave?" No, he can't. It's a rhetorical question. In fact, all of this really is a rhetorical point. What futility have you created all the children of man? What man can live and not see death? What is the point? What is the purpose? And how can I survive through all of these trials that I face? In the 90th Psalm, the passage that Joe alluded to in his prayer, and in verse 12, the psalmist says, "So teach us to number our days, that we may gain a heart of wisdom." We think in terms of years. But remember, 80 years, if you get to live 80 years, that is 29,200 days. But if you only had 100 days to live, only 100. In your entire life, 100 days. How much more would verse 12 mean to you, knowing that you don't have thousands of days, but instead, and you don't even have hundreds of days, you have 100, that's it. Teach us to number our days that we may gain a heart of wisdom. This speaks to perspective and priority. It speaks to recognizing what truly has value and what truly matters in the time that we have on this earth. In Ecclesiastes chapter 12 and in verse 1, Solomon observes, and verses 1 on through verse 8 and 9, really, he's dealing with basic imagery of old age. He describes different faculties starting to fail. That's why he starts this in verse 1. "Remember now your Creator in the days of your youth, before the difficult days come, and the years draw near when you say, 'I have no pleasure in them.'" He's not saying that there's no virtue in old age and in the, hopefully, wisdom that experience brings. What he's observing here, remember now your Creator in the days of your youth before the difficult days come. Not that you'll forget God when you're older, but that the worst damage you can do, generally speaking, is when you're young and brash and hot-headed and don't really think before you do or think before you say. Remember your Creator in the days of your youth, so that you can pattern yourself and have the priorities from the get-go. Because eventually, life is going to catch up with you. When we talk about our values, when we talk about our priorities, remembering that God is always watching, remembering that God has given me a purpose, that God has given me a standard by which to live. Sometimes people can get inside their heads and say, 29,000 days? I'll wait to serve God tomorrow. I mean, what's another day? I'll wait and serve God next year. I've got 80 of them. I'll just wait until next year. But the point of these passages reminds us that not only is life short, life is not guaranteed either. 80 years is not a guarantee. Old age is not a guarantee. So when Paul writes to the Ephesians in Ephesians chapter 5, he tells them in verse 15, "See then that you walk circumspectly, not as fools, but as wise." Remember, a lot of Solomon's Proverbs and his writings in Ecclesiastes contrast the foolish man and the wise man. Well, Paul writes to the Ephesians, he says, I want you to walk circumspectly. Be aware of yourself and your surroundings. Be aware of the circumstances in which you find yourself. Be aware of the temptations that are coming. Walk circumspectly, not as fools, but as wise. Well, what do the wise do, Paul? They redeem the time, verse 16, because the days are evil. Days aren't good or evil. What Paul's describing is the fact that anything can happen at any given point, on any given day. Now keep in mind that we're carrying with us the idea of 29,000 days. No. What if you just had 100? And by the time you're actually conscious, old enough to be aware and conscious of that fact, you're maybe down to 80. 80 days. Redeem the time because the days are evil. Each day carries with it its own temptations, its own trials, its own events that are outside of your control. So take your life and be circumspect and redeem your time. It's interesting, these phrases, Paul uses it twice, this term to redeem. Redeeming time. But it carries forth this suggestion or this inference that time doesn't really belong to us. We're redeeming it in that we've been given. It is a gift. It is not time that we're owed. It's not time that we're guaranteed. It's time that we've been blessed. That's all it is. Verse 17 of Ephesians 5. Therefore, do not be unwise. What did he say? Walk circumspectly, not as wise, or not as fools, but as wise. What do the wise do? They redeem the time because the days are evil. Do not be unwise, but understand what the will of the Lord is. That's how you can be wise. So that you can take the will of the Lord and walk circumspectly with the will of the Lord, redeeming your time in the will of the Lord. That's what the wise will do. Would this be something that would have even more value? If we found ourselves in a situation in which we go from having our entire lives ahead of us, some of us, to having absolute certainty, all you've got left is 80 days. That's it. In Colossians chapter 4 and in verse 5, Paul writes, "Walk in wisdom towards those who are outside, redeeming the time. Let your speech always be with grace, seasoned with salt, that you may know how you ought to answer each one." Paul deals with the Ephesians of redeeming time in their conduct, in their life, in their application of the will of God. But here in Colossians, Paul applies the same concept of redeeming time, recognizing that time is a limited commodity and that it is not owned, It is really Lent. You've been loaned this time. You've been granted a certain time. So what can you use your time to do? You remember God. Make sure I remember He's always watching. He wants me to follow Him. Don't be rash. Don't jump into anything without thinking first. Walk circumspectly. Be wise. But also use your time to be aware of the influence you can have on others. That's why he says walk in wisdom towards those who are outside. Outside of what? Outside of the body of Christ. Redeeming the time. Every single one of us, has someone, either a family member, some loved one, a best friend. Every one of us has somebody that we know is either not a Christian at all, or they're not serving God faithfully if they are. Every one of us has someone in that position. And no matter how much each one of us may want to help the other with their loved one, with their friend, with their best friend that they've had since elementary school, we will never have the opportunity to have an influence on that individual. You might very well be the only one who can have an influence of a positive nature to prick a heart. You never know. You may have come to the kingdom for this very reason, Esther. God may have brought you into that person's life for the very purpose of giving them an opportunity to hear the gospel. Walk with wisdom towards those who are on the outside. Redeem the time you have with them because your time is limited and so is theirs. That's why your speech should always be with grace, seasoned with salt. In Ecclesiastes chapter 7 and in verse 1. Ecclesiastes chapter 7 and verse 1. Solomon says, a good name is better than precious ointment, and the day of death than the day of one's birth. It is better to go to the house of mourning than to go to the house of feasting, for that is the end of all men, and the living will take it to heart. Sorrow is better than laughter, for by a sad countenance the heart is made better. The heart of the wise is in the house of the mourning, but the heart of fools is in the house of mirth. The wise understand what the will of the Lord is. The wise walk circumspectly. The wise redeem the time, knowing that the days, you never know what's going to happen today or tomorrow. So Solomon says, the wise recognize it's better to go to the house of mourning. It's fun to go to the house of laughter. It's fun to have a good time and try to forget your worries and your cares and so forth. That's fun. But what has meaning? What gives a proper remembrance and a proper reminder of the priorities that one should have? Going to the house of mourning, he says, verse 2, for that is the end of all men. Well, that's great, Solomon. Thanks. Thanks for reminding me of my mortality. But notice what Solomon says about it. That is the end of all men, and the living take it to heart. As a preacher, I can count on one hand the number of things I really don't like doing as a preacher. But one of them is preaching funerals. I don't enjoy preaching funerals. It's a sad thing. It's a sad thing to see family members who are weeping, who are going to miss their loved one. But you know what? There's something about funerals of Christians that stand out from funerals for anybody else. And I have preached funerals for people outside of the body of Christ. Those were not pleasant. Those were not enjoyable whatsoever. Funerals shouldn't be enjoyable anyway. Preached a funeral in Florida one time where it was a young fella. He was 25, 26, and he died. He choked to death on his food. He fell asleep while he was eating. And the sorrow that family went through. He wasn't a Christian. It was difficult for me to think of much to say. I did the best I could. I preached about salvation. I preached about the fact that we never know what's going to happen and that we need to make the best of the time we have. When it comes to Christians' funerals, Christians who die in faith, in service to God, there is a sorrow that we're going to miss them. But there's also a sense of joy, a sense of looking forward to what is to come. After the gravesite, I generally take a few minutes after whether I'm preaching it or not, if I'm at a gravesite, after it's done, I kind of walk up and down and I look at the tombstones. Sometimes I'm just looking for old ones, see how old of tombstones that I can find while I'm there. Other times I'm looking to see what the little thing may say about that individual. Just a few words to try to sum up somebody's life. And I say all of this to say, I don't like doing funerals because it reminds me that I'm going to die. Now, as a Christian, that should be a happy thing in the sense that we look forward to being with the Lord. But as a human being, the idea of not being here tomorrow, that's scary. From a physical, mortal, which is how Solomon speaks, from a under the sun perspective, the idea of not waking up in the morning is terrifying to a certain extent. But that's Solomon's point. He says, the living take it to heart because it reminds them that you have a limited amount of time. Use it to the best of your ability, putting the proper priorities in your life that you need to. For a lot of people, that means eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. So let's live it up, let's party, let's have fun, because we aren't guaranteed tomorrow. But Solomon says that for the wise, it reminds them of the perspective that I'm here for one purpose and one purpose only, to fear God and keep His commandments. Sorrow is better than laughter, for by a sad countenance the heart is made better. Why? Because it reminds us of the reality of life. And the reality of life is that it ends. I was watching a show, I forget what the name of the show was. And I don't remember exactly what the scenario was, but I do remember this fella, his mother passed away. And she had recorded some kind of CD for him to listen to. And he was listening to it, and she said that the only thing that makes life worthwhile is that it ends. If life was just ongoing, you would take it for granted. If you couldn't die, if you couldn't get sick, you just take it for granted. But the fact that in this life, there is always that ever-present danger, it reminds us to make the most of the time we have with our loved ones, with our families, our friends, the people we care about in this world. I asked you to imagine if you only had 100 days to live. And I'm not just talking about 100 days from now. You were born and you die in 100 days. There's a reason why I asked you to try to imagine that. Roll your eyes if you want to. I was watching a sci-fi show yesterday, which just happened. I was thinking about this anyway, and then this show was like, okay, that's a great parenthetical type of analogy to make. Stargate SG-1. I'd never watched it before. I was watching a couple episodes. And in one of these episodes, the humans from Earth, they go to a different planet, and they encounter other human beings, but for some reason, they were born and they died in 100 days. And that was it. And through the process of this episode, one of the individuals becomes infected with this virus, which is what's causing it. And all of a sudden, he starts to age quickly. And he only has another 14 days to live, because all of this is caught up to him. And during that process of time, he begins to realize how much he had taken for granted, because he was only 40 years old. And all of a sudden, he's only got 14 days left, and he's aging 10 months a day. And all of a sudden, he's old, and he's gray. He can barely walk around. But then they find a cure. And this young lady who was his friend, and he was talking to her, and he was trying to kind of relay to her the lesson that he was learning. But for her, she didn't know any better. 100 days, that's all we have. And when he tried to explain to her that the humans where I come from have thousands of days, she couldn't comprehend it. So when the cure came in and she's talking to him, this is what she says. You're going to get to live, we're going to get to live? Yes. For thousands of days? Yes. That's almost forever. That quote struck me. Remember the time that we had, 80 years? Does that seem like forever to you? Does it seem forever to me? And some of you are closer to 80, some of you are over 80 than I am. 29,200 days. Seems like a lot, but it doesn't seem like forever. But to somebody in their frame of reference, from their perspective, compared to 100 days, that's almost forever. I bring this up because when we talk about life and we talk about death, it's about priority and perspective that defines how we're going to utilize the time that we have. Paul said on 2 separate occasions to redeem the time. We are not going to redeem the time if our perspective is such that I can just do it tomorrow. I've got 29,000 days. I can spare one and do it tomorrow. The priorities that we have in our life will dictate how well we redeem the time. And it's not just something that God will know. It'll also be something that can be observed by our family, our loved ones, by our close friends. People will be able to observe our little kids. It's amazing how often I catch my kids looking at me. It's creepy. It's like they're constantly watching me. Every time I turn around a corner, there's another one of them. How many do we have? They're always there. But you know what? It reminds me that they're always watching. And that's scary sometimes as a dad. But you know what? Certain habits that you may have that are bad habits or whatever, they're going to pick up on it. Things that you do that maybe it's just become a routine for you that you don't really think about, they're going to pick up on it. And if my priorities are not to fear God and keep His commandments, guess what? They're going to pick up on it. In Romans chapter 13 and in verse 11, Paul says, "Do this, knowing the time, that now it is high time to awake out of sleep. For now our salvation is nearer than when we first believed. The night is far spent, the day is at hand. Therefore let us cast off the works of darkness, and let us put on the armor of light. Let us walk properly, as in the day, not in revelry and drunkenness, not in lewdness and lust, not in strife and envy, but put on the Lord Jesus Christ, and make no provision for the flesh to fulfill its lusts. Do this knowing the time. What's the time? What does he say? Our salvation is nearer than when we first believed. Very similar to what we hear Keith say on a regular occasion. One day closer. That is, in essence, exactly what Paul's saying here. Our salvation is nearer than when we first believed. Why? Because days have passed now. And every day we live is a day closer to judgment. For some of us, that'll be salvation. I hope all of us. But for other people, it won't be salvation. Final passage for you this afternoon in Ecclesiastes chapter 12 and in verse 13. Let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter, and incidentally this lesson. Fear God and keep His commandments. For this is man's all. For God will bring every work into judgment, including every secret thing, whether good or evil. Fear God and keep His commandments. This is man's entire purpose. But you know what? It's so easy to forget that, isn't it? In the midst of all the stuff going on in our lives, the responsibilities, the pressures, the demands on our time, it's easy to forget we're only here to fear God and keep His commandments. There are things that we have to do. But while we get our degrees, and while we save up for our 401ks, and while we do our Roth IRAs, we are to be fearing God and keeping His commandments. Because you know what happens? What happens is, or all that needs to happen, is just a moment of forgetting that that's why I'm here. All it takes is a minute. If I forget that I am here to fear God and keep His commandments, if I forget to remember God, if I lose perspective on my priorities, that's all it takes. And I can be everlastingly lost if I'm not vigilant. This is why Paul says, redeem the time, because the days are evil. If you don't redeem the time, those days can bite you. And unfortunately, those days can condemn you if you're not serving faithfully. That's the lesson for you this afternoon. And I didn't design this lesson to be discouraging or depressing. I designed it to be a reminder, especially I've had Ecclesiastes on my mind, to remind us that as we go through this life, every now and then just pretend, instead of having 29,200 days perhaps to live, why don't we take it from James's perspective? You don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. Therefore, you should say, if the Lord wills, we will live and do this and that. Because what might happen? What might happen? I don't want it to happen. God forbid that it happen. But what if you should not wake up in the morning? What if tomorrow is your last day on earth? I want you to really let that sink in. And imagine how you might live tomorrow if you knew with 100% certainty that at 5 p.m. tomorrow, that would be it for you. How would you live differently? What choices would you make that maybe you wouldn't otherwise? How would your priorities change? How would your language, what you say, what you talk to with your loved ones, your friends, your family, how would it change? Because you know what? That's how we're supposed to live every day. Live every day as if it's our last. Not to eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die, but to redeem the time and understand what the will of the Lord is. The lesson is yours. We offer an invitation to those who are not Christians to be baptized, to have your sins washed away. Those of us who are Christians, we need to make sure that we're constantly reminding ourselves to have the proper priorities on how we view our time here. But not only that, but to try to impress that upon our children, impress that upon our grandchildren. Because they're young and often they don't really think about the consequences of what they're doing when they're jumping off of bunk beds. And they never know what can happen because they're too young to really understand it. We need to impress upon them how important it is to think and make sure everything you do with God in mind. So that one day, regardless of how many years or days you live, one day you can stand in judgment before God and He can tell you, the Lord can, you redeemed the time I gave you. The invitation is extended. If you're subject, please come forward as we stand and sing.